In this presentation, we illustrate the use of dWebSpec for the specification and implementation of dynamic web applications. We shall first provide a brief overview. Web application development has enjoyed rapid growth over the past decade. This is partly due to the numerous innovations that enhance usability and interactivity, making web applications comparable to Windows or desktop applications. These have made the web not only a suitable platform for document sharing, but also suitable for various types of applications, from e-commerce to corporate enterprise solutions. The pervasiveness of web applications has given rise to many frameworks and platforms aimed at providing more logical approach as well as easy and rapid development of dynamic web applications. What is missing in this evolution are some fundamental principles that have been associated with data processing for a long time. An example of an omission is the concept of preceding application implementation with specification and design phases, as expressed in the Software Design Lifecycle, SDLC. Another issue relates to the separation of concerns. With composite frameworks and rapid development schemes, it is easy to overlook the diversity of specialties that are now required for robust dynamic web applications. These vary widely from user interface engineering to security specialties. It is this specification or modeling processes and generation of blueprint that dWebSpec provides to developers. Providing such with the recognition of the separation of concerns as well as the need for common documentation as well as contracts among the different roles involved in such development. dWebSpec provides for comprehensive specification by providing a layer over standard specifications and modeling schemes like UML. This layer provides for web-specific areas that are usually elusive in the standard schemes, whereas acting as glue that integrates such specifications. This provision is also along the lines of the areas of concerns. In the rest of this presentation, we illustrate a full life cycle development involving dWebSpec. Although references will be made to domain objects, methods, and handlers that would be specified in standard models, such mentions are part of discussions of dWebSpec, without intention to delve into general modeling. In this presentation, we shall illustrate the use of dWebSpec with a small application. We shall go through the requirements as would normally be relayed by a business analyst. We shall then capture the described requirements with dWebSpec specifications. Finally, we shall translate the specification into code and syntax for 3 exemplary platforms. The application we are using for this illustration involves a conference registration or reservation application in which individuals would register their name for conference for particular dates. The requirements are as follows. The registration process would allow users to enter their name and desired date to attend conference, after which they would click the Save button to send the request to the host. In return, the registration would be acknowledged with the message and registration number. The entries would be represented on a read-only basis. The user could then record this number and date and press OK to close the application. This we would call the happy path. In the alternate, the date specified might not have a scheduled conference, or else the registration for the date might be up to the capacity. For these, a message would be provided and inputs redisplayed on a read and write basis to allow the user to pick another date. Some input and page validations would also be required. The name entered must be at least 6, but no more than 25 characters. The date must be a valid calendar date entered in U.S. month first format. Both name and date entries are required. The page validation would be required both on the client and the server side. This is becoming a common requirement for applications, especially for those that are MVC, Model View Controller based. The view tier is assumed to be pluggable. Therefore, the replacement of the browser-based view with a telephone gadget view might imply that scripting is not available. The client validation would thus be unavailable, but the server side would come into play. The start of dWebSpec specification gathering is the content source. By content source we mean the HTML or XHTML that could be the start of the mockup process for the series of pages that would be used in the application. The content source would eventually become the input for the implementation by translation process used by dWebSpec. A primary aspect of dWebSpec is the identification of dynamic elements on the page. As we shall see later, these are mostly regular HTML input elements that the various platforms would generate dynamically. Their presentation aspect specification would reside in the source content and associated files like the style sheet, whereas their dynamic specification would be placed in other artifacts to be discussed. The linkage between these specification artifacts are the identifiers like name and ID attributes. Whereas some dynamic elements have direct equivalents to simple HTML elements, some do not. Some have equivalents to sets of simple elements, and some have no representations at all. For example, some dynamic elements perform logical or repeat operations on the page. These are represented with annotations that appear unobtrusively on the page. A simple example of dynamic items on the page that do not have direct HTML element representations is mock text that would eventually be dynamically generated. The representation of such is as shown. Another set of dynamic items that are identified on the page are the segments. As an example of segments, we should recall the section of the page that was normally invisible but becomes visible when the user has successfully registered. This is shown on the page with the same non-obtrusive annotation. For the mock process, this segment could be disabled by removing some of the dashes in the annotation, which would allow the segment to disappear. For a simple page as the one we are showing, the usage of the annotations as part of the mockup process might not appear so significant. However, complicated applications have pages that may contain many segments that require as part of the mockup process for them to be enabled in the same combination as they would be dynamically enabled. This would allow the verification and optimization of the aesthetics of the assembles. The source content thus provides a composite view of the page as well as the identification of dynamic contents. Some other notable dynamic contents on the example page are the message and error responses that are annotated at the top of the page. Also annotated are the button segments that appear on a mutually exclusive basis. As mentioned earlier, this provides the registration of the dynamic elements as well as the many dynamic facets that the page could present. Without the use of methodic annotation as provided for by dWebSpec, it is common for the user interface designer to capture the static representation of dynamically assembled pages with a series of HTML pages. The tedium of such repetition is usually reduced by cutting and pasting. The advantage of a single source of the representation of many static facets of the page is the usage of a unique source that would eventually become the starting point for the dynamic implementation. In this section, we provided an overview of dWebSpec as well as the capture of the visual presentation specification. In the second part of this presentation, we shall discuss the specification capture for the dynamic aspects of the page.